They flipped from saying there was nothing wrong with Joe Biden to pressing his departure from the race. And now, of course, with Kamala Harris, they have not done a great job in getting her, of course, on the record on many of these positions that she has, and really failed to cover the unique circumstances very well under which she was made the nominee. I'll be writing an article about why bother to have primaries anymore if the Democrat Party and maybe Republicans would like to do the same. They certainly didn't want Trump as their nominee in 2016.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Who watches the watchmen? Who polices the police? Who reports on the reporters? The answer to all of those questions in a free society is supposed to be a free press. So how's America's fourth estate doing, particularly since the New Yorker's David Remnick announced after Trump's election in 2016 that all of the usual journalistic standards were suspended until further notice, as all hands were needed on deck to get Trump and, say it with me, save our democracy. The good news is that into this journalistic vacuum have stepped independents interested in reporting news that is contextual and consequential and thus meaningful. News you can use, it used to be called. There are still those telling the thought-provoking stories that get people to look at the world around them rather than simply dishing out stultifying partisan tripe that leaves people mesmerized by their navels. One such throwback investigative journalist and the host of a program called Full Measure is Sharyl Attkisson. In advance of Attkisson's appearance on our program, I went back and did a cursory glance at the unique stories Attkisson has done just over the last couple years that I've used on my radio program in Chicago to drive political and policy discussions with my listeners. For example, Attkisson's interview of the Small Business Administration Inspector General, who estimated that there was conservatively $200 billion of COVID-related fraud committed against the SBA alone and American taxpayers by extension. Among the never again lessons from COVID is the willy-nilly printing and drop shipping of funny money. The lockdowns and the devaluation of our currency are a direct link to the inflation of the last 3 years that has decimated the household budgets of so many families. That's news you can use. Another example, Attkisson's interview with a former Acorn operative who became a whistleblower on the state of whistleblowing in America. It was excellent background for the whistleblowers within the IRS that came forward about the Hunter Biden investigation, whistleblowers who Attkisson also interviewed, I might add, or the whistleblowers in the Department of Homeland Security who have come forward about Homeland Security's ongoing violation of federal law regarding those who enter America illegally. A good conversation was had about the seeming unanimity of support for transparency in government until it's you or your agency in the spotlight. I don't think it's hyperbole to suggest, so I'm going to do so, that Attkisson and a handful of other independent journalists, many with backgrounds in the DC corporate legacy media, are America's Samizdat. With that, I'm pleased to welcome Sharyl Attkisson. She is the recipient of 5 Emmy Awards and an Edward R. Murrow Award for investigative reporting, back when those awards meant something. She's also worked at CBS News, PBS, and CNN, and she is a 5th-degree black belt master in Taekwondo, so don't cut her off in traffic. She is also the author of a timely new book out entitled Follow the Science, How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. Sharyl Attkisson, welcome to Counterculture. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, let's before we get to your new book, Follow the Science, and some of what you've been reporting for several years now, investigating and reporting for several years. I just wanted to get your perspective now that the conventions have been completed and we're looking at that post-Labor Day rush to November 5th. What's your perspective on the DC press corps coverage of this election, both with respect to the saga that led to the replacement of Biden and the coverage of Kamala Harris since her replacement?
Well, clearly the media served the goal that Democrats, at least the ones pulling the strings, wanted. They flipped from saying there was nothing wrong with Joe Biden to pressing his departure from the race. And now, of course, with Kamala Harris, they have not done a great job in getting her, of course, on the record on many of these positions that she has, and really failed to cover the unique circumstances very well under which she was made the nominee. I'll be writing an article about why bother to have primaries anymore if the Democrat Party and maybe Republicans would like to do the same. They certainly didn't want Trump as their nominee in 2016. But Democrats have shown in the last 3 elections that they've literally rigged the system so that others cannot run against Democrats. Other Democrats can't run against the Democrat they choose, and they kind of anoint the person they want. They may not count New Hampshire. They may not count Iowa because they're not going to vote for the right person. They may not let Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s votes count for him. Those were all going to go to Biden if he'd have stayed in the Democrat Party. So I think that's fascinating. And then lastly, this whole question of when Kamala Harris is going to do interviews, even when she finally does one, it's still this length of time that has passed where we haven't been able to become familiar with her. And as we all know, familiarity can kind of breed contempt in a way once you get to know more about a person. Everybody already knows everything about Donald Trump. She's still in the honeymoon phase, and it looks to me like the media is working to keep her there as long as possible so that maybe people don't find out too much about her or how she acts or what she thinks until after the election.
Yeah, I want to just stick on that for a second because get your perspective. You've been covering politics for a long time in these races. I mean, is the coverage of Kamala really so different than the coverage of Obama as the Messiah leading into the 2008 race, the coverage of Hillary Clinton making history in 2016, the coverage of Joe Biden, Scranton Joe, the centrist? I mean, for a while now, the DC press corps has been in the image making business. So for as much as there has been this discussion and lament in some quarters about they're sort of reinventing Kamala Harris, rebranding her, representing her. Well, that's what they've done for a long time. They understand the position that their party's nominee has to occupy, and they get about making that person comply to that market position, whether they do or not, right? I mean, this has been happening for a while.
Yes, and I would say that the media has allowed campaigns to not be accountable to the public or the voters as they're campaigning. By that, I mean, we let Joe Biden remain in the basement, literally doing virtually no outreach, and yet he won. I think that's a formula that they think works for them. They're more likely to be criticized or be seen as negative if their positions are thoroughly examined and they're out there more. Clearly, if Democrats were confident that America would like Kamala Harris's positions and behavior, they would put her out there. The fact that they're keeping her so close to the vest is the tell that they don't think she's likable or that her positions would stand up to scrutiny, to independent scrutiny.
It's a tell about the party to which she affiliates too. I mean, you would think somebody at that level would have enough self-respect to say, look, I can handle questions. I can handle myself. I'm the vice president of the United States. I was a senator. I was an attorney general. I was a prosecutor. I can go out there and I can go one-on-one with Trump. I'm not afraid of him. I'm not afraid of being interrogated by the DC press corps. But I think it's interesting that all of these candidates really fly in formation with the image making that's done by the DC press corps.
I think that's true. And, we haven't even seen enough of her. Gosh, Donald Trump, the press was part of passing along rumors that he was on cocaine in 2016. I don't know if you remember that, when he was sniffing during a, debate or something. He's in fact never had a drink in his life. I assume that's true because if it weren't, somebody would have dug up, accounts of him having a drink. We've tried to scrutinize Joe Biden's mental health. We haven't really seen enough of Kamala Harris to even look at those ancillary things about what her habits and personality are. And is she, competent in terms of making day-to-day decisions and being all there, how hard she works, how willing she is to be on. I also think one more thing I'll bring up is the media got diverted into the argument over whether she was technically the border czar or not. Both sides kind of got diverted, in my view, or distracted in arguing that point. That point is almost irrelevant. Yes, she was the border czar, but the point is, under her administration with Joe Biden, this is what's happened to the border. I don't think it matters technically whether the fight is won over her title or not. I think the emphasis should be looking at her, the policies that she did or didn't implement.
Well, right, but the press corps is busily helping her sort of formulate this facade about making a clean break from the administration she's been a part of, which is really something to witness. You know, on day one, I'm going to do this. On day one, I'm going to do that. When she's had a lot of day ones over the last 3.5 years to do things that she hasn't done or even attempted to do. I tried to do it, but President Biden wouldn't let me. I tried to do it, but the Republicans wouldn't let me. She doesn't even make those claims.
That's right. And, you know, I think Afghanistan remains one of the biggest disasters, not only in our military history, but also, of course, of the Biden administration. That has not gotten sufficient scrutiny and answers, and that's huge. I mean, nobody, from what I can tell, was ever held accountable. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the after action report, but of course the federal agencies aren't beholden anymore to the law, so I don't have that report in hand. But someone, you know, needs to ask the questions of what she would do to make sure something like that didn't happen again, especially since she's on the record saying she was the last person in the room and she was fully on board with how things were handled.
Do you think that this paternalism by the press with respect to these Democrat candidates actually has the opposite effect? In other words, it makes them more vulnerable because at some point they're going to be tested, and because they've been cocooned by the press, they're not ready for that back and forth on a debate stage, for example. I guess the only solution to that would be to not step on a debate stage at all.
Yes and no. I mean, I think her supporters, or the people who will still vote Democrat without knowing virtually anything about the Democrat and without having cast a vote for her in the primary, they're not going to change their minds. It doesn't matter how she does, you know, in the debate. So there's a section of America, you know, let's say 42% on each side that's going to vote for their candidate no matter what. The question is, how does this impact those in the middle? And I do think it's not good probably for the independents that truly are looking, maybe I'll go one way, maybe I'll go the other. There's not a lot of people in that field. But the ones who are, I think they should be and probably are put off by the lack of appearance, her ability to appear in public, and then could be impacted by her debate if her debate performance is poor. But I think the media will say her debate performance was excellent because it will be arguably better than Joe Biden's, and that will be the bar. Look how she was there, you know, she didn't stumble. She knew what stage she was on. She knew where to go when the debate was over. So I think that will be the bar the media will set for her.
You know, I mentioned at the outset about David Remnick making that clarion call after Trump was elected in 2016, the editor of the New Yorker, one of the deans of the DC press corps, if you will, saying, you know, basically the journalistic standards are of the past are no longer applicable because we have to get Trump. More or less what he said. I wonder if that really represented a watershed moment in the history of the press in this country, and whether or not there's been any pullback from that line that was drawn in 2016.
Well, apparently not. And I've written about this. It was the New York Times, right, that put out this watershed, as you put it, moment that said, we are going to suspend our normal ethics standards and guidelines to cover a uniquely dangerous president. And I argued all along, when you don't like a candidate, that's when you have to follow your ethics rules and guidelines. It's sort of like you don't need free speech rules for speech that you like. You need it to protect speech that you don't like in order to have the kind of society we've decided we want. The same rule applies to journalism. In my book, you have your ethics rules and guidelines so that you treat people and issues fairly, even if you don't personally agree with them. So the fact that the New York Times thought, let's just suspend this, it gave the green light not only to news organizations all over the world, which for whatever reason follow the New York Times, but also to journalism schools and journalism professors who applauded this biased and unjournalistic trend that began at that date. And I don't think there's been a lot of pushback because once that was unleashed, all the people who felt that way and wanted to cover stories that way were rewarded when they did. They finally had their chance to, you know, say and do what they want. And they got more prominence when they broke stories that were maybe not fair, sometimes were wrong, weren't punished when that was exposed in most cases, but continued to achieve prominence. Look at Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. She was sort of discredited in my book at Politico, but then the New York Times hired her and others to cover the Trump White House, in my view, hiring discredited reporters that they knew would take a position and report unfairly, as they often did, on Donald Trump, who they claimed was uniquely dangerous. I think this has been a terrible trend for journalism, but in some respects, it's opened the eyes of people who, it's so audacious that people who may not have noticed what was going on with journalism bias, they now see pretty clearly what's happened.
Well, in fact, it's converted some people. I mean, Michael Schellenberger, who has a blurb, a jacket blurb for your latest book, Follow the Science, one of the reporters for the Twitter Files, Matt Taibbi. These are men of the left who basically said, look, I got some things wrong, or whatever I thought about this larger press corps that I'm a part of, I have to look at how they're actually conducting themselves, and I have to separate myself because, I actually believe in a free press. And so what the federal government was doing, trying to put its thumb on social media platforms, it's not something I can support, and it's something that people should know. I just wonder, if you and Catherine Herridge maybe, and Taibbi and Schellenberger and Barry Weiss at the Free Press, represent a real pushback, or you're just sort of, a handful of voices in the wilderness against, an overwhelming orthodoxy that it's difficult to not be marginalized.
Well, I think it is a lot of the second part of what you said. It's hard to break through when, to get the information out, you rely on the structure that is biased against that information. But bucking the trend, along with the journalists you named, is of course Elon Musk for Twitter/X, which has been a big help. Glenn Greenwald, another journalist that you say, I think he would say he's pretty far left, but has come around to agreeing with many on the right on some of these issues of government overreach and free speech. And then in politics, look at Robert F. Kennedy Jr., classic Democrat coming from the left, who finds himself in that same position. I feel like there's a new group forming. It's not just of Democrats and Republicans, and many Americans lie in this group. They may differ on specific issues. They may not agree on climate change and gun control and things like that, but on big issues like democracy and government overreach and free press that are really impacting us today, they are in alignment. And it's a pretty big group of people, I would argue.
Well, the other thing, since you brought him up, RFK Jr., and he made mention of this recently when he endorsed Trump, these issues, sort of these issue categories that he has tried to profile and really are central to his campaign, him and Nicole Shanahan, about basically the mental and physical well-being of children. And I'm not saying I subscribe to all of the theories that he puts forward about the quality of our food, or the incidence of mental diagnoses among kids, and what is causing that. But he's raising an issue that's real, and that we were talking about actually as a country before COVID. We were talking about the number of people on antidepressants, particularly young people. And then it all sort of went away. We had real skepticism of Big Pharma. There was a series of documentaries about the therapeutic state and people on antidepressants and psychotropic drugs. And then it went away during COVID when Big Pharma was our savior, supposedly. And now to some extent, RFK Jr. is bringing it back. And I know you tackle some of this in your new book.
Absolutely. I think COVID opened a lot of eyes, once again, of people who weren't paying much attention when they saw the government putting out misinformation about very important things. People who, like me, like I used to think, the government would never lie, the government would never put out anything that's not in our best interest. I didn't understand how all of this worked. I think a lot of eyes were opened, and it created activists out of people who had never seen themselves that way, starting to look at what's in our food and our water and so on, including me, in terms of branching out beyond just prescription drugs, for example. I'm now looking at chemicals and pharmaceuticals in what's in our food and what's in our water. And I'm shocked, just like the vaccine autism debate, when I had my mind set without much information on what I thought was true initially. And then I come to find peer-reviewed published studies and credible scientists who are saying the opposite. With the food, the more I dig in, the more worried I become. And I think in America, from what I hear from ordinary people, they see there's a chronic health epidemic among everybody, but particularly our young people, that our medical establishment is either pretending not to see or ignoring. And I think that's the most baffling thing to those of us who think the government is here to help take care of us, or that our federal health agencies should be watching out for this, and that our own doctors should be watching. When we go and bring our children or complain about certain things or ask questions, and the doctors either don't know or give wrong answers or don't listen, I think there's a ton of people in that category that are now worried about the same things as these issues that you've raised.
Well, also too, I mean, the lack of accountability breeds corruption. And so this is another failure of the fourth estate, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I remember this mashup from a couple of years ago, where it was Pfizer sponsors just about every show on every cable news and network news station. Every news show, 60 Minutes. This sports update is brought to you by Pfizer on CBS Sports. So the money that was flowing from Pfizer in particular, but not limited to Pfizer, from Big Pharma, but specifically Pfizer, into all of these corporate media enterprises, well, of course you're going to have a conflict. And so then Pfizer gets a pass on everything that was COVID related and everything that they did, and all the flacks that were out there for them. And so it's not only that piece of it, but then also, so Pfizer also, with the incentives that we found out that they had for doctors, for medical professionals, in terms of the, if you get this number of people vaccinated, it's one compensation tier, and then this tier, and then that tier, and so forth. So the money that flowed, that went sort of unscrutinized from Big Pharma into our media outlets and to our medical profession, that to me is a huge story. Even if there was nothing nefarious, it presents the appearance of conflict that needs to be fleshed out.
Absolutely. And that started in earnest in the early 2000s, the conflicted relationship between big drug companies that were allowed to advertise prescription drugs on TV and now exchanges of billions of dollars didn't used to be allowed. I mean, young people may not know, we're one of the only countries that allow prescription drugs on television to be advertised, and that this is a relatively new development in terms of our history. And once that relationship was forged, not only did these drug companies take part in interfering in our newsrooms because we didn't put up firewalls, which I was suggesting at the time. There needs to be a firewall between news editorial and corporate and the money and so on. But not only that, but now it's just self-censoring. The reporters know, without even having to be told, don't do a story about this particular company. They know if they do, it's not going to air, it's not going to run. They're not going to get patted on the back for that. In fact, they'll probably be discouraged. So it's almost unspoken now in many newsrooms that they're not going to cover these really important stories that are impacting, the problem with our drugs and our system is impacting virtually every American if you think about it. And we're not covering these important stories.
Well, it's funny. I don't know if you saw it, but during the DNC, Chris Cuomo, formerly of CNN, now of News Nation, he was talking about the money at the DNC, and he's pointing up at all the corporate suites and saying all these people that are saying they're going to take on the billionaires, they're actually being looked down upon by the corporate financiers of their party. So Bernie Sanders rails against a billionaire, then JB Pritzker follows him on stage, and then all these corporate titans that are paying $1 million for a suite here. I mean, it's a charade. It's almost Soviet in terms of the disconnect between what is being said and what the reality is. And of course, this was Chris Cuomo, who was a shill for big corporations when he was at CNN. But I mean, the reality is both parties, and this is to some extent why Trump has been attractive, have been shills for these corporate interests and more or less captured by those corporate interests. And it includes the media.
Yeah, I call it performance art to hear them stand up and say the things. When Michelle Obama gave a technically great speech in terms of how she delivered it and how she moved her hands and her inflection, which is I found similar to Barack Obama's, the whole delivery. But the things she said, as I was watching her say that her grandmother taught her to be suspicious of people who take more than they need, and how we have to give so that we don't have as much so that other people can have more. And I'm thinking about their mansions and how a lot of the things, I remember when Obama was president and when he was leaving office, I wondered if he would live by the things he advocated or would have forced upon others, such as proposals to live for neighborhoods full of wealthier people to be forced to take low-income housing in the neighborhood, which would reduce property values and have all kinds of problems. But he saw that as a positive. So I thought, well, when Obama leaves office, if he lives in a mixed neighborhood with poor people next door, he believes in what he's saying. If he drives around electric cars and doesn't fly around in jets, if he doesn't let his guards have guns, if all these things are true, then he believes in what he's saying. If not, he just wants to apply rules to us, but not live by them himself. And to me, that was sort of the story of what I heard at the convention. Maybe a little off topic, but when you're talking about how the parties say one thing and are behind the scenes working with these very entities or corporations, you're right on that, but other fronts as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, maybe if they would have just accepted the Obamas 40 million from Netflix instead of 50 million, maybe we could believe they were down with the struggle. I mean, it's laughable, but what you find is, it seems to me that like hypocrisy is the privilege of being a member of the left, right? Because yes, I have all these trappings, but my focus is on the downtrodden, allegedly, and I'm imposing mandates on other people, and I'm going to stick it to wealthy people like myself. It's all very Leonard Bernstein and Radical Chic. I'm offended by my wealth, and so so that's good enough that you just ignore my wealth and you accept that I am somehow in psychic solidarity with you.
And then I will point out my theory of why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is so hated amongst some Democrats, amongst the party officially, and why Donald Trump was and still remains pretty despised by some in the Republican Party, the party leaders, has to do with more than mean tweets or RFK's position on vaccines. This bad press has been generated, this propaganda about them, by the forces that these two men are not beholden to. And we're talking about, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry. Other Republicans and Democrats are largely controlled by the party, which provides access and exchange for money in a longstanding, decades-old system of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Suddenly, Donald Trump enters the picture, and the Republican Party string pullers can't ensure access and decisions in the favor of those corporate people that they've said they can take care of. They don't know what Donald Trump's going to do. He didn't rely on them to get elected. He's sort of the wild card. That makes him dangerous, and that's why one reason why there had to be such a big propaganda campaign against him. And I think RFK Jr. Falls in a similar category.
100%. And actually, when they were on stage in Arizona together, they basically echoed that sentiment. And I think they need to develop it more, sort of the explanation you just provided, because one of the things that they have to be afraid of now more than they were even in 2016 is that now he's been through this for 4 years, actually closer to 9 all totaled, in terms of understanding the landscape and how things actually work, the machinations, the shot callers. And so now he's really dangerous because now he knows where he should focus attention. Now, whether he wins and whether he can do that if he does win are separate questions, but at least he has sort of actionable knowledge that they wish he didn't have.
So I have not yet written this article I keep thinking about that I would be calling Trump's last laugh, because in the end, it takes a long time, but Trump seems to pretty much win most of his battles. Maybe it takes years. But the fact that he thinks he was cheated out of the re-election in 2020 and forced to sit out for 4 years, if he's re-elected, that allowed him, as you say, to do some reflection. There were people working with him that were not on his team, and that came out after he was out of office. So he's had 4 years to rethink who the personnel should be, to, instead of lurching into more chaos because they were impeaching him and trying to charge him with crimes and all that stuff, he's had 4 years to take a breath, to develop a strategy, to be stronger against knowing what to expect if he's elected again. He may have, if he's reelected, a stronger second term with the 4-year break than he ever would have had if he had gone straight into that second term.
I wanted to get to another topic. I know you cover this a bit in Follow the Science, and I don't want you to give away all of the anecdotes and the research you did for your book, but COVID, just because it's back in the news, in particular, from my perspective, this study that was done by Oxford that was released last week that looked at vaccinations among some 200,000 plus kids aged 5 to 15. And the net of it was that the risk of the vaccines was higher in terms of a negative health event for kids in that age group than than getting COVID. And so it's just more evidence to throw on the pile, I know, but it's important evidence. It's important to put together the scientifically credible research that supports the argument so that next time around we have this to say, we're definitely not going to do that again, are we?
That's true. I mean, it was always known by scientists who knew anything and were independent that the risk of a vaccine that has risks known and unknown is always going to be more than the risk of the disease that for healthy children is almost zero risk. So you just look at that calculus, that has to be the case. Now more people are saying so, even as the government still recommends kids get these I think they're still experimental vaccines. But wait, what was the end of your question? Because I kind of went off on a sidebar there.
Well, the study of kids at age 5 to 15 being vaccinated and the vaccine being more dangerous than getting COVID, and what that means for how we do the postmortem on COVID and how we look prospectively to the next pandemic.
So I think one of the biggest failures is we now know all the mistakes made, and a lot of them I made a list and followed the science of CDC data mistakes and analytic mistakes that have to be intentional. First of all, it's outrageous if nobody there caught them, and ordinary folks like me and others who looked at it caught these mistakes. But they look intentional because they always went in one direction. They always made COVID look more dangerous, particularly to children, right as they were about to promote the vaccines for children. Really big mistakes that they were making in stats and so on. But I think the biggest failure is that there's been no reform, there's been no accountability, and that ensures the same thing would happen again. I mean, maybe you'd have more people raising up, but the government itself and our public health agencies, why wouldn't they repeat everything they did when they've all never admitted that what they did was wrong? CDC simply said they did a look back that they commissioned about themselves and basically said, oh, they were just too good and too focused on science. They need more money and they need more ability to do quick response and more of this. Nothing about what they did wrong in the misinformation. Nobody held accountable. And I have to say, the Republicans in Congress, I interviewed one of them right before they took back the House of Representatives control. And they promised to do this accountability. That would be job one, like of CDC and so on after the failures. And they've held hearings, but nothing's happened, nothing. And in fact, these agencies have all gotten budget increases with no strings attached every year since. So Congress is as corrupt at the party level. I don't mean every individual member. Some of them want to do this accountability, but neither party is going to do what needs to be done. They don't work for us anymore, in my view. They're working for the big money interests who make sure to feather their nests and donate to the parties and so on. So they're not hearing our voice, and it's just such an outrage that they've codified what happened and nothing's changed.
No, I know. I mean, in point of fact, to keeping up appearances, there was a story out last week. Kamala Harris's staff is still required to keep their vaccinations up to date, because you have to keep up appearances. And we're still sending through CDC and NIH, we're still sending money to Chinese communist scientists, despite everything we know about what they did in Wuhan with the outbreak. I mean, so you're right, the inertia behind doing things the way they've always been done and the interests that are tied to the status quo, I think are really underestimated. I mean, they're just immense. And maybe, I mean, my only hope politically is, yes, Trump wins and you get back the Senate and maybe you unleash Ron Johnson and Rand Paul, because those are the only two politicians I've really seen that are committed to continuing to beat this drum, even when they're in the minority and they don't really have any power to do more than beat the drum.
I don't know if people remember when Donald Trump was president and the stuff came out about China, and it was always true, and some of us were reporting on it, but it couldn't get past the censors in many cases. But he withheld money or ordered money be withheld from a nonprofit, which was one of these routes that our taxpayer money was going to China. And there's such a scandal. China still has not cooperated on the COVID outbreak with us to let us inspect the facility that we helped fund, or help us on the front end with understanding what really happened so that we could maybe have controlled the outbreak better. And there's been no accountability or punishment to China for this. As you say, partnerships still exist. And when Donald Trump tried to withhold some money, what happened? The scientific establishment rose up against him and said, he's so anti-science that he's stopping this research funding. And basically they forced the money through this, I don't know, massive sentiment to be opened up again. There were some restrictions put on it, but I'm just stunned at how, whether it's the medical establishment, scientific establishment, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, they have a million ways to try to end run a president like Donald Trump, who's not on the same page with what they're used to being able to put over on the American people.
And as you say, the response to any sort of failure is, we agree the program or the agency is not big enough. We need more money. It needs to be bigger. I mean, we see this at FBI, at Secret Service, at DHS, at CDC, at NIH, all the alphabet soup agencies. They all run the same racket. And the directors, I mean, you could put Rowe from Secret Service at DHS and Mayorkas at Secret Service, and you get the same responses on the same issues from the two.
And you could bet if it was their personal money, if members of Congress had to take money out of their pocket to support, let's say, Secret Service after some debacle, they would say not one more penny. In fact, we're going to look at how you're spending the money and cut back on all this fat and waste that you're probably spending, because Secret Service, I forgot the figure, they get incredible amounts of money. Yes, they do a lot of work, but the size of what they have to do, which I also looked at, is so much smaller to me than the budget that they get. At some point, that bureaucracy and the trappings can create inefficiencies and the various types of things that we're seeing now. If it were their money, Congress would be penny pinching over these issues, but it's not their money, it's ours. So it seems like they're not serious in most instances about letting go of the money. It makes the federal agencies happy. It gets them more support on the back end from the contractors and industries that, benefit from that. And again, it's our money. They don't really care.
No, it's public choice theory 101. My attitude towards Trump, and I'm not, I don't know if you like Trump or not, and I don't what your partisan affiliation is, if any, but my attitude on Trump, and this is really post-partisan because I'm not a huge fan of the Republican Party myself either, is if he could just go after the administrative state and cut out the leadership and do reduction in force of 20, 30, 40% just across the board at all these agencies to deliver some sort of general reckoning, to challenge the belief about the need for the size and scope and reach of these agencies in these various sectors, that would be a successful presidency.
Here's my fear. Based on what we've seen, this kind of action needed to be taken or started decades ago. The federal agencies are now so big, and those who rely on them or have a contract with them, it's almost everybody, it's almost every company in America, that drastic reductions could probably be made without hurting services and the things that we count on. I think so much money is wasted. But would a president survive that? Because there would just be a massive uprising and riots and impeachment attempts. I don't know if a president could survive it because of the sentiment. The media would be behind that side of it, of course. Just like, Trump promises mass deportations. I don't think that'll ever happen. The first tearful, woman and child that are sent over the border that don't want to go. I mean, the media is going to play that up. That's going to last all of about a minute. It's going to be really hard to make big changes. And I really don't know how that gets done. I think it needs to be done. I don't know how that gets done.
Yeah, I mean, nobody better positioned than a lame duck President Trump with some axes to grind, some scores to settle. But the problem, of course, is at the congressional level, where everybody in the House is up every 2 years, and whoever's up in 2 years in the Senate, there's going to be a lot of squirming and uncomfortableness. That's the problem. Is, do Republicans, if they were given the purse strings and even some comfortable majorities, do they really have the guts to exercise them? And even a conservative a philosophically conservative guy like Mike Johnson, I'm not convinced that he does. And if he doesn't, I don't know who does.
Well, it would have to be a party leader that could never be elected as the party leader because of the views that we're talking about. But there are members who've been all about that. Before he passed away, Senator Tom Coburn was one of the few left that was still talking about his single issue was government waste. That was just what everything was all about. And, you look at our debt and our deficit, and there's virtually nobody talking about it. I had members tell me from the Republican Party, who used to be thought of as more fiscally conservative on stuff. I don't think they are so much anymore. It's just different how they want to spend the money. And one of them told me, and I've heard it said since then, you don't win votes by cutting budgets, you lose votes. So they're looking at getting reelected. That's their job one. And you never make people happy. You make the public happy, that's who they're supposed to serve. But the people giving them money to stay in power, you never make them happy by taking away money. So they've kind of given in and just thought, here's our priorities. We want the money to go out the door too, but to different things. But nobody virtually is talking about a massive cut in the responsibilities the government takes on, what it should be doing, and how much they spend.
Before we let you go, I wanted to get your perspective on free speech in America, free speech and a free press, all the freedoms contained in the First Amendment. This against the backdrop of the CEO of Telegram being arrested in France for crimes and what France considers crimes. He is a collaborator in any criminal activity that takes place on his platform of millions of people and hundreds of millions of communications. It's quite the gaping legal standard. The arrests in England of people who post on social media something that the authorities consider hate. We have a vice presidential candidate in Tim Walz who has said the free speech protections does not cover misinformation, particularly about our democracy, whatever that means. I mean, I don't want to hyperbolize the threat, but I mean, what you're seeing in Western Europe and what you're hearing from and seeing from private and public actors alike in this country trying to censor speech that's misinformation or hate speech. I mean, how concerned are you about a dystopian sort of development in this country like we're seeing in England and France?
I think this is one of the biggest issues of our time, and the health issue, America's health, and they're connected. And I'm just back from Europe, by the way. I'm covering that story and others on my upcoming episodes of Full Measure this fall, looking at the very things you're talking about. It's stunning. I mean, 20 years ago, if you had suggested to me that any American would be cheering on censorship, let alone that the media would be behind it, I wouldn't have believed it. But it's been an effective propaganda campaign that's led us in a slippery slope down that path to people accepting that, well, there's some speech that maybe is akin to violence. I remember I first heard that about 10 years ago, someone saying certain speech is so harmful it's akin to violence. And I thought it was a joke. Well, now that's a position that many people take, that harmful speech that hurts your feelings is the same thing as physical assault and should be punished just like that. I think it's chilling and scary and horrifying. I think it's huge. And I can't believe there's so many people, I think, that have been convinced to be a little on the fence. Well, if something's not true, maybe that should be censored. And they don't understand to play out the whole scenario of who decides what's true. First of all, only illegal things, in my view, should be censored in general. Now, there may be some adult things that children shouldn't see, and that's probably handled by legal laws and stuff too. But you want the government and whoever happens to be in charge at the moment to be the arbiter of what the truth is. We saw during COVID how poorly that worked. And the fact that that doesn't resonate with more people, that there isn't a single arbiter that has the information or the authority, in my view, to be the one that decides what truth is and what good is and what hate is. It's just stunning that all these discussions are being had. And I think it's a really big issue that, again, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. understands, coming from the left, but what happened to him. And I think Donald Trump understands, even though he's coming from further to the right.
Yeah, the only thing scarier than the people who don't understand the precedent that is being set are the people who do understand. Yeah. But I hear you. Sharyl Attkisson is an award-winning investigative journalist. Her new book, pick it up, Follow the science, how Big Pharma misleads, obscures, and prevails. Sharyl Attkisson, thanks so much for joining us on Counterculture. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.